Now begin questioning our witnesses. Then we'll alternate between parties. In recognition of the gentleman from the home state of Georgia, I will allow Mr. Loudermilk to begin our questions. Mr. Loudermilk.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, panelists, and the folks who have come out to witness your government at work. Because we're doing this here, we probably have 3 times the amount of people that we would have if we were doing this hearing in Washington, D.C. And I appreciate you being here. Now, one thing I do have to comment on is my colleagues on the other side, as you heard, have complained about this being the 9th hearing we've had on this piece of legislation. I think transparency and accountability is good. I think it's something the American people expect. Had we had that to the 2 federal takeover bills, H.R. 1 in the previous 4 years that the Democrats rammed through this committee with barely even 1 hearing, you would have found out in that a whole lot more about those bills. I think the transparency and accountability is a good thing. Now, before I get into my general questions, I have learned something from my colleagues because this has been a recurring thing by my friends across the aisle at all of these hearings is the discussion about questions of who won particular elections. And I think that's a valid question to ask. So what I'd like to do is ask each of you this question, simple yes or no answer, and then I'll get into my other questions. And I'll start with you, Dr. Ruth. Did Brian Kemp win Georgia's gubernatorial election in 2018 and 2022?
Yes, he did.
Mr.
Yes,
Spakowski. Ms. Nerdin?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Woolard?
Yes.
Thank you all. I appreciate that. That's, as you may hear, that question has been asked in another form in past hearings. But let's move on to the context of what we're here about today. And one thing I'll say, look, I appreciate y'all being here. Like many of you, I've spent many hours watching the Braves play in this building. Unlike some of you, I actually attended games that were in the building that was across the street. In fact, the first Braves game I attended at 3 years old, and I didn't even remember it. So it's good to be here doing this, and I appreciate everyone being here. Mr. Von Spakowski, good to see you again. Thank you for your continued attending these hearings in the field and in Washington, D.C. Simple question. What were some of the most important and key provisions of SB 202 in your opinion?
I think one of the most important was the extension of the state's voter ID law, which was first effective, as you know, in 2008, in that presidential election. But it only applied to in-person voting. And the state extended it to absentee balloting. They made it extremely easy for people to comply with it. Obviously, it did not in any way hurt turnout. But given the huge increase in the use of mail-in or absentee ballots, having an ID requirement for that, I think, is one of the most important changes that states can make. And as you know, other states followed Georgia's example, Texas, Florida, et cetera.
I appreciate that. It was interesting is before we started here earlier, I had a member of the media come to me and say, I've been looking over the bill. This seems like something that should be bipartisan. Why is there an argument against Senate Bill 202? What is the argument on the other side? They were honestly asking this question. So in your opinion, what is so controversial about any of the reforms that are in this bill?
Well, I don't think there should be any controversy over them. Look, the biggest complaint or criticism you always hear is that, well, if you require an ID, you're going to suppress votes. We know that's not true. And the reason we know it's not true is we now have turnout data for almost 15 years. And the turnout data overwhelmingly shows it does not suppress turnout. The National Bureau of Economic Research released a study in 2019 looking at turnout across all 50 states from 2008 to 2018 to compare states with ID to other states without ID, and said it clearly has no negative effect overall or for any group defined by age, gender, race, or party affiliation. Just this year, a new study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in which they took a look at this claim that has been made by some that, for example, voter ID laws benefit the Republican Party and hurt the Democratic Party because it somehow disproportionately keeps people out of the polls. They studied elections from 2003 to 2020 and looked at state-level races, governor, state legislature, congressional and presidential races. It actually slightly gave an advantage, apparently initially, to Democrats That disappeared by 2012, according to the study, so it doesn't hurt either party. And in fact, they said the one thing they saw consistently across the board was it increased turnout because it apparently motivates and mobilizes the voters of both parties.
So people from both parties want to make sure that their votes are counted and that
Yes.
their votes matter, and that's why this is important. Mr. Chair, I yield back the time that I have already exceeded, and I hope we have several more hearings on this bill as we go forward because it's very important.
The gentleman yields.